5 O'Clock at Barney's by Adrian Romagnano. Read by Zack Markey. It's always 5 o'clock somewhere. An unknown alcove.
Prologue. "What'll it be, old-timer?" he asked the relic of his species sitting before him at the bar. He was serving a Nostalgi, an old one at that. The Nostalgi were one of the earliest species to gain sentience when the great proverbial stew that was life finally came to its galactic boil. That was over 10 billion years ago. Being one of the earliest prototypes of intelligence amongst the stars came with some problems. The Nostalgi had fervently held onto their cultural identity, even as their species evolved far beyond the scope of such trivial third-dimensional idioms. The result was that their species almost went extinct around 4 millennia ago, and now live out the rest of their shifts, searching for each other in a desperate attempt to repopulate their species. "Have any Spetigo?" he asked the barman. Barney turned around and looked at the shelves behind him, trailing his fingers over the library of bottles and jars of liquor and other recreational beverages. His fingers stopped. "Spetigo," he said as he took the bottle from the shelf. The old Nostalgi nodded. He didn't have an eye, but a sheen flushed across the bulb of his head, and Barney interpreted it as an emotional signifier. The anticipation of satisfaction was glowing across the ancient one. He filled a bag with the liquid and inserted a pin into the shimmering antique sitting opposite him at the bar. His skin was tough, and Barney had to push it through with a little force. Finally, it was in. "Ugh," said the Nostalgia as he relaxed into his drink. "Where are you coming from?" asked Barney. "The Croft Nexus," he replied. "Just travelling through. Thought I'd go see the old Kazabi monument there." Barney feigned interest with a nod as he cleaned a glass with a tea towel as his customers started rattling off facts about the monument at Kazabi. Its craft, its history, its mystery. He could tell the old-timer hadn't spoken to anyone for a long time, so let the living fossil waffle on a bit. "How much?" he asked, finally igniting Barney's interest. He looked at the old Nostalgi. "All the ass, old-timer," he said. "Really? Thank you, kindest of auras." Barney went to the shelf and took the bottle of Spetigo from it. "Here," he said, offering it to the old Nostalgi. "We don't have much call for it here anymore." The subtle sheen on the old Nostalgi's bulb flashed brighter than before. "I couldn't possibly," he said. "I insist," said Barney. The Nostalgi reached out a second tether from his midsection, and Barney clasped it in his hand. There was no universal handshake amongst the stars, so species expressed gratitude however they could and whatever the gesture. The sentiment was always the same, and with that sentiment, the old Nostalgi's head bulb dipped and nodded. He slithered against the door, the tether activating the motion sensor, and made his way back to his ship. Barney waited at the door as the ship began to ascend towards the stars. It felt good to have made the old-timer's last shifts that little bit better. It was the highlight of his shift. Feeling pleased with his kindness, he turned and went back to the bar. The old Nostalgia ship had barely ascended past the Envirodome when suddenly Barney's attention was drawn to an explosion just beyond the Envirodome. "Damn it," he thought. "Oh, I should have kept the portal." Chapter 1. Barney's was a bar on an obscure asteroid in an obscure asteroid belt in the arse end of the galaxy. His rock's official identifier was A61607219-Delta. It was a massive rock in the Felix asteroid belt, somewhere far beyond the reach of humanity's ever-growing grasp. Barney had no idea where exactly he had been dumped, but his abductors had telepathically advised him that it was to be his new home, and that he would never see Earth again. They never told him why. That was almost 3,700 years ago, but who's counting? The asteroid was rich in precious metals, but barren of the other natural resources needed to sustain human life. Barney's abductors had installed knowledge of survival into Barney's brain, and their parting gift would allow him to manipulate the rare metals on the asteroid to fabricate everything he would ever need to sustain himself on the rock. Before long, he had smithed machines and filters and was able to extract fluids and proteins and other substances from the resources around him that would keep him nourished and sheltered, but tethered to the damn rock. Because of this, his life had been withered down to shifts, and because the years and days passed in measures beyond his ability to calculate, Barney had forgotten how old he was. Sometimes it made him wonder if he was immortal, because it felt like an eternity had passed, but in deeper thought, he'd realize it might have only been moments. He decided he didn't want to find out. Barney's was a largely unknown enterprise to the wider galaxy. No one ever set a course to visit his little bar amongst the stars, but somehow they all found their way there. A61607219-Delta's size made it stand out amongst the other asteroids in the cluster, but the venue itself only held around 100 patrons. Barney had managed a much smaller venue back on Earth, and so when the abductors had dumped him there after establishing livable conditions under their supervision, and after he realized that once they figured out he wasn't going to die, he did the only thing he knew how to do: get everyone plastered. 5 o'clock was happy hour at Barney's, and as they used to say back on Earth long before the Eco-Enviro decompression event, it was always 5 o'clock somewhere, and so Barney's was almost always busy and bustling around 4 or 5 hours after he set the beacon to open. "Ready for another one?" he asked Geila, the astro whore. He had called her an astro whore because she didn't know what a whore was. It turned out the oldest profession on Earth was also the oldest profession in the galaxy, and whilst Geila's home planet had hookers and whores and professional pleasure providers, their status amongst the Astoundil held different connotations to those who practiced the same arts on Earth. Geila came from a species called the Astoundil. Their skin was a gradient of greens and yellows and had 4 arms attached to a long torso that slithered along the floor like a serpent's of seduction, stealth, and serenity. The 4 arms had once been sets of legs eons ago, which had evolved into arms from a time when their species were forced to live in tunnels underground, and legs had been a hindrance to their having to crawl around on their bellies, and because of their exodus underground, their heads had taken on a peculiar triangular shape to help them burrow through whatever made up solid ground on her home planet. She was the astro whore because she had spent 40 years studying the astrology of her home planet, Latoria. 40 years learning how the stars foretold the future of any sentient being, only to find out that spirituality was dead amongst the stars. Her chosen path failed. She spent another 40 years training for a degree in the sensual pleasures. She had learned to tighten and loosen her receiving orifices so that she could accommodate any shape the galaxy could or would thrust upon her, and she could even protrude and prolapse her organs at will so that they could be used to pleasure species with receiving orifices. She sat at a table on her own every shift in the corner of the bar, waiting for travelers who wanted to know if the outcomes of their voyages would be fortunate or failures. However, more often than not, they just wanted to fuck her, and so, reluctantly, she would make her way to the room Barney had made available to her and put the second part of her 80 years of education to good use. Barney allowed her to rent the room for free because she was good for business. Most species usually required some form of replenishment after exerting themselves upon Geila, and Barney was always ready with a drink and a smoke. She would smile after every service, but Barney could see she wasn't really happy in her work, even though it brought so much satisfaction to others. "I probably shouldn't call her a whore," he would sometimes muse as he watched her twirl her finger around a glass in the corner of the bar as the lively party raged on around her. He had never propositioned her for her services, though she often offered them to him as a courtesy for him having afforded her the space to practice her craft. He never accepted her offers, but would sometimes humor her by sitting at her table with her during the quieter hours of the shift and allow her to read his astro charts, so that she would feel like she was paying her way somehow. "This place is going to be really important someday," she'd tell him, and he would nod, unable to grasp how much an insignificant enterprise amongst the stars could have any effect on anything the size and scale of an entire galaxy. The upside of having a tiny bar on a massive asteroid was the parking. There was plenty of space for everyone to park their ships and landers. Some of them were the size of megacities, and others literally were megacities. Sometimes colonization missions would stop briefly for the governor to get a quick one in whilst the crew and colonists were none the wiser. Then there were the unofficial travelers. Bounty hunters, cosmic scavengers, cartels and cargo pirates, entertainers, competitors, warriors and warlords. They were the meat and brutality of Barney's operations, and some of the more enterprising members of the fringe elements of galactic society even used Barney's venue as a base of operations for their illicit business dealings. Entire planetary systems had their extinction signed and paid for at Barney's, but he nor the general public of the cosmos would ever know it. The only rule at Barney's was to leave your interplanetary petty bullshit at the door. There was a pinboard in the furthest corner of the bar which most patrons assumed was a barred list, an open photo book of beings barred from Barney's for having broken his cardinal rule. It was, in actuality, a pinboard of faces that were all preserved in the coldness of space and the dust of the asteroid buried at the back of Barney's bar. Barney was very reasonable about it all. First, he'd tell them to knock it off, and then show them the board and make them memorize the faces on it. Then, they would go to the back of the bar, past the kitchen, where his private quarters were stationed, and from a balcony he would point out into the vastness of the asteroid plains, where some of the heads of those who were pictured on the pinboard had been stuck on reinforced barbs sunken into the dust to give any future wrongdoers a first-hand interpretation of the masterpiece that was the pinboard. Chapter 2. It was a regular shift at Barney's. The sun was dipping over the horizon, and the shadows of the rockwork were just beginning to slide across the floor of the bar. It was nearly 5 o'clock. Barney stood wiping a glass, and Geila sat at her table. "Ready for another one?" he asked her. "Always," she replied as she perked up and moved her hands across the cards and crystals on her table in the corner. The door swung open, and the first customer of the evening entered. It was a lonesome Ziknir who was on his way to reconvene with his crew. He was a regular named Arg. "Good all today?" asked Barney. "Aye," said the Ziknir, as he flashed his credits to Barney. Barney looked at the payment and exaggerated an expression of interest. "By the way, cost of drinks just went up," he said. "Inflation." Arg laughed and slammed his fist on the bar jovially. The thud made some of the cups hanging overhead clang and jingle. "The usual," he ordered. "Actually, nah, make it double, you know, inflation." Barney poured the purple ooze into a cup and filled it to just before the top when he'd ordinarily fill it halfway. The Ziknir took it to his beak and he slid a tongue into the cup, lapping up the gelatinous ooze. Arg the Ziknir ordered 3 more doubles after that, each one taking longer and longer to gulp down as his senses became more and more dulled. Before long, more patrons had entered. One was even another human. Barney kept his eye on the human, as he hadn't seen one since his abduction. He made sure to converse with the man before he left, hoping he'd have information about anything human-related. Turns out, the human was also an abductee who'd been sold to a slave trader in some unknown sector. He had earned his freedom by saving his owner's life in a shootout, but having no knowledge of how to traverse the stars himself, he had chosen to stay on with his owner as a co-worker and now roamed the galaxy enslaving and trading in other weaker beings. Barney despised the man's line of work, so kept a professional distance from him after learning the man's backstory. He had dealt with these types of men back on Earth. He wouldn't give that first warning if this one broke the rule. It would be straight to the pinboard, he decided. Here, he said to the man. "Let me fix you something that I don't give to humans." He gave the man the same purple ooze he had served Arg, and after 2 sips the human had slumped into a coma, his comrades having to drag him out, vowing to take advantage of him when he was back on the ship. "Can he stretch to that girth?" asked Geila. "No," said Barney. "Humans aren't naturally stretchy," he said. Geila gave an expression that Barney had come to understand as, "Ouch." The troop the random human had entered with were known as the Sin, and theirs was a reputation of trouble. They didn't flash their dealings and generally kept to themselves, but for a more barbaric species, they were methodical and professional beyond their reputational shortcomings. They had a way of avoiding the sanctions from interplanetary institutions, and the galaxy hated them for it. The man they were carrying off on their shoulders was clearly not up to their standards of operation, and it was only a matter of time before he would make an unforgivable error and find himself either back in their slavery or dead. "They were here a bit longer than usual," said Geila. "Yeah, I noticed that too," replied Barney. "And that human that was with them. They've never taken him before. He was one of you. I thought you would be more excited to see another one of you." "Ugh," he snarled. I would have been if he was a respectable one, but he's just another abductee dumped in the universe without enough spine to make his own way around it. What's a spine? Asked Geila. Barney tapped his back. The next evening, long after the sun had dipped and was about to shine its light on the asteroid again, the Sin returned. True to form, the one who had carried the human out the night before was now wearing his flayed flesh across his shoulders like a trophy. Geila looked shocked, and the yellows of her gradients dulled to an orange, an evolutionary survival instinct to make her species blend more into their surroundings in times of danger. But if Barney felt the same, he was able to hide it, as if the sight of the only other human he'd seen in centuries being worn as a robe was an every shift occurrence. He sighed. Barney was a businessman, and wearing a person like an animal might make the other patrons think they were being served by one, so he wandered up to the 9-foot-tall creature covered in bone plates and politely made a request. "Mind taking off the coat, buddy?" he asked. The Sin looked at him and snarled his bony lip. "Why?" it asked. "'Cause he looks familiar, don't you think?" asked Barney. The Sin went to answer, but Barney interrupted him. "It's a rhetorical question," he said. "Take my kinsman off your damn shoulders." The Sin snarled again before dropping the skin coat to the floor like a silken cloth with a melon stretched into it one end, the weight of the head still attached stealing the bulk of the gravitational pull of the drop. "Thank you," said Barney as he went back to the bar, leaving the Sin to their business. In the opposite corner of the bar, Barney noticed the long, slender outlines of 2 Frigaine staring at the congregation of Sin who had arrived. If they saw the 2 Frigaine, duty and tradition would dictate that they try to kill their ancient enemy, and Barney would not have any intergalactic geoplanetary political bullshit unfolding in his bar. The 2 Frigaine slid down in their booth as they made eye contact with Barney. They were outnumbered and AWOL, their lack of uniform badges suggesting they didn't want anyone to know that they were there, and so, when it kicked off, and it would, there was no way the 2 Frigaine could fight off the horde of Sin sitting between them and the door, and no way they could signal for help. They looked at Barney, and he nodded his head to the back door. They nodded back, and slowly, quietly, made their way out the back while the Sin began to make themselves comfortable with small foods, intoxicating beverages, and psychedelic fumes. Barney made a stop over at Geila's table on his way back from ushering the Frigaine out. "Scared off more customers," he said. "They certainly do have a reputation." Barney turned his head towards them, and he pretended to wipe down her desk as he monitored them from a distance. "Bad for business," he said. Geila only offered a nod in agreement before one of the Sin approached them. "How much?" the Sin asked Geila. 20 credits per reading," she said as she spread her hands across the table of cards and trinkets. The Sin laughed. No, he said. "For this." He brushed his tunic to the side, revealing a larger than usual Sin phallus. The skin of a Sin's dick wrapped around the meat of the shaft like a synthetic fabric of nano-nylon twisted around a popsicle stick. The head of the alien impregnator was like a bull ring, designed to link in to the receiving clitoris of a female Sin, so that the ejaculation could be passed more effectively should something come between the copulating pair in an effort to tear them apart. She stuttered. "I'm not entirely sure I can accommodate that," she eventually said. She'd never said that to anyone before, and even Barney was a bit taken aback. "Go on, love," said the Sin. "Give it a crack. Your tiniest one will do," he said lewdly as he gestured to Geila's female receiver on the front of her underbelly with his porky digit. She quivered and whimpered, looked at Barney, and flashed him the same expression as before. Ouch. "If I must," she finally said in resignation before taking the Sin's stubby palm in hers and leading him to the private quarters on the level above the main dance floor of the bar as the rest of the Sin congregation cheered at the good fortune of their comrade's purchase. Barney continued to watch the party of the evening unfold as he washed glasses and served ale. The Sin were discussing something, but he couldn't tell what. At some point in the long hours before the sun had risen to its zenith, the Sin's gathering had taken on a more somber, almost business-esque undertone. Suddenly, their group became much quieter, but felt much more agitated as they fidgeted and adjusted themselves, as if they'd run out of things to discuss and were stuck in an eternal, awkward silence. Suddenly, a window in the bar blew out and the venue began to decompress as air rushed out and space rushed in. Alarms rang and sirens and strobes whirred to indicate the breach, but as the air evacuated, the hyper volume of the alarms became muffled and dull, as every sound began to become muted as their frequencies lost their path of travel.
Emergency pressure balance. Emergency pressure balance. Emergency pressure balance.
A mechanical voice said over a loudspeaker as Barney quickly attended to the broken window and filled it with a temporary structural foam from a hydrant that spluttered everywhere, with the atmospheric evacuation blowing the flow to and fro until the emergency shutter finally closed, and the bulk of the blowout was contained with the foam finally able to be controlled enough to seal the edges. "Who's paying for that?" he asked the party of Sin after the mayhem had subdued. They looked at him and snarled in a mixture of disgust, rage, and seething emotional suppression. There had been no one else in the bar whose species was at war, and they frequented Barney's because their war with the Frigaine had no place in his bar. The Frigaine knew that too, and yet they had just been targeted. They knew they had been betrayed. Before the Sin could answer Barney, a hailstorm of needler rounds burst through the door into the booth where the Sin were sitting. They peppered the bony muscles of the space gangsters and drilled through their armor plating until they had burrowed deeply into the flesh below. Blood streaked across the entry wounds of the regular guests, like watered-down ketchup across a dinner plate, separating from the uncoagulated juices of a near-raw chunk of meat. The Sin who were hit the worst slumped dead in their spot, their contributions to the Sin instantly forgotten by the luckier survivors of the mob. The Sin and other patrons who were a bit more fortunate had tried to take cover, but almost none had been able to escape completely unscathed, and even Barney had received a superficial scratch. The painfully endowed Sin, who had settled with Geila for the evening, came rushing down the stairs, opening fire back into the doorway with a triple-barreled, handheld sucker punch rotator turret, a 3 RSP. The sound of violence in this place of pacifism rising him to the action as his combat instincts kicked in over his sensual passions. His sucker punch bullets tore through any part of the structure standing between him and the Frigaine that were partially outside and partly stuck in a bottleneck at the entry door. Had it not been for his retaliating fire, the Frigaine assailants could have potentially broken through the bottleneck and massacred everyone in the bar without anyone ever knowing. Had they fought harder to suppress his fire, they very well may have been successful, but with the sheer volume of his weapon, the shootout was over almost as soon as it had begun. Great, thought Barney as he picked up the overturned chairs, shattered glasses, and table illuminators. Geila was coming down the stairs to inquire as to the commotion that had caused her client to leave her bedside. "You betrayed us," yelled one of the Sin as he clutched his blood-slicked arm. "I did no such thing, you scoundrels. You know the rules. You're barred, all of you. You hear me?" "How did the Frigaine know we were here?" the Sin with the injured arm asked. "'Cause they were here too, dickhead," admitted Barney. "I'm a businessman. I serve anyone who wants what I got to sell, and the Frigaine drink too." "This will not be the end of this," said the one Sin who had escaped the carnage because he was been reaping his own across all of Gaila's orifices. "You know the rules," said Barney. "And so do they. Take it someplace else." There was no answer as the injured Sin mumbled and groaned, picking themselves up off the floor and making their way for the now decimated entry-exit door. They checked that their coast was clear and scurried off into the morning light of the asteroid. "This will be bad for business," said Geila. "Don't I know it," said Barney. Chapter 3. The next night, the bar looked a little different. The comfortable antiquity of the venue had been interrupted by the necessary intervention of modern technology. The cold, off-white atmospheric shutter with the hardened filler foam bordering it was a hard contrast against the warm, worn-out lights and subtle red table illuminators that flooded a dull orange against the largely navy blue walls that hadn't been painted since ever. The mixture of red and clear blood of the sin had largely been washed off the booth it had been sprayed across, but there were some patches that Barney simply couldn't remove, which formed splotches on the seat cushions more akin to human lovemaking rather than alien murder. Other than the obvious, Barney set to work as he usually did, by cleaning glasses, wiping down tables, and arranging bottles. Geila came downstairs and began to lay out her cards, and before they had time to acknowledge each other, there was a knock at the door. Geila looked at Barney.
"We're closed,"
he said.
"Come back in an hour."
The door opened in spite of Barney's request, and the two Frigaine who had used the back door the previous evening entered the premises with their beaded scalp fibers jangling against their folk-skinned priority organ protectors and their Cyclopean visors. "Thank you for last night," the bigger of the two said as he threw a card on the counter. "Gratitude." The card was loaded with several thousand unmarked and untraceable units. Barney slid the card back to the Frigaine.
"Thank you, but no thanks. I'd rather you just obey the rules."
"We did," said the smaller Frigaine, and the Barney replied with a gesture to the door spotted with pockmarks of sucker punch and needler munition rounds.
"You didn't organize that?"
he asked, and the Frigaine went silent. "We have a proposition," said the larger of the two Frigaine. Where the sin were big and brooding with hard armor-like skin, the Frigaine were more slender and lighter toned. Where the sin demonstrated great strength, might, and brutish warrior fraternity, the Frigaine showcased skill, poise, prowess, style, and grace in a more formal fashion. Theirs was a culture of pomp and ceremony. Frigaine traditions centered around the evolution of their civility and dedication to quality. They had moved far beyond merely surviving. They were a conquering species. In comparison, sin traditions were crass and informal, and served more to form honest but uncivilized social bonds. Where the Frigaine sailed the stars in fleets that were once moored to the methane shores of their home planet, Jessos, the sin were pirates who had stumbled upon spacefaring technology by happenstance of more advanced species being sucked into the orbital pool of their home planet, Mithlurin. And so, the grace and poise of the Frigaine High Commander, Lishwa Shitu Fembram, the larger of the two Frigaine, began to put forth the proposal authorized to him by the Chancellors of Jessos. "You may have noticed a steep increase in the number of return customers failing to actually return," said Lishwa Shitu Fembram. The latest incident he was referring to was, of course, the old Nostalgie passer who had been mistaken as a sin envoy.
"That old-timer had nothing to do with your war,"
said Barney as he wiped a glass with a tea towel that he should have washed probably a dozen shifts ago. "You are correct," said the smaller of the Frigaine. "He was mistaken for one of the sin. His ship bore similar markings, but I guess your sin comrades failed to even advise you of their ship's call signs, let alone markings."
"We're not comrades,"
said Barney. "We wouldn't know," said Lishwa. "The way they come here and congregate like hooligans, who can know where your bias lies?"
"I'll tell you what I told them,"
said Barney.
"Anyone who's got currency to pay is welcome," he said. "And by the way," he added, "what do you do in a place like this anyway? I thought we'd be a little bit too lowbrow for the likes of the Frigaine."
"You are correct," said the smaller Frigaine, earning eyes like daggers that shot through his soul from the larger Lishwa sitting beside him. Barney glared at the smaller Frigaine and let the insult slide, assuming the little Frigainian was unaware of the insult he had unintentionally delivered. "It's true," said Lishwa. "Your establishment is not our usual style, but I will admit that it is not undesirable."
"Nice save,"
thought Barney as he watched Lishwa try to undo the damage done by his apprentice. "We've come to learn that the Sin view your establishment as, He paused trying to find the right words. "As a no-man's land," the little Frigainian finally settled on. "You're not in alliance with us, nor are you with them," added Lishwa. "But we do know that despite your formal stance, they do use your establishment to undertake activities and dealings deemed illicit under the interplanetary treaties of Akash Ganga."
"The Felix laws?"
said Barney with a chuckle.
"I don't formally recognize those laws either."
"You don't need to,"
said the smaller Frigaine. Your own activities here don't contravene any of the Felix laws, nor are they a hazard to anyone in the galaxy as a whole. What the Sin do here under your... He hovered his finger around his face, gesturing to where he would have a nose if he were human. It was true. The Sin weren't doing dodgy deals at the bar, and Barney knew it. Trade boomed on the dark side of the asteroid, away from the prying eyes of Barney's video captures. It kept the war going. It kept the Sin well armed and fueled up the machines of war. The Sin had used their tribal culture to form bonds with species as socially mature as they were, but they were not stupid, nor were they bad. A tad barbaric, perhaps, but not bad. Sin were good to their world. That's why Barney liked them. They were his kind of folk, but wherever they went, the violence followed. Sometimes it wasn't their fault, but sometimes it was that damn cultural immaturity that got them into stupid situations. And well, those who played stupid games amongst the stars often won stupid prizes, and the trophy cabinet of the Sin civilization was full of stupid prizes. We want to use your establishment to stage an ambush, said Le Choix, the larger of the two Frigainians. An ambush? Barney asked. And why would I allow you to do that? The two Frigainians didn't need to say anything. Their currency was enough, and they knew it. Or, Le Choix added, we might accidentally misidentify your customers as well. You'll be killing some of my best ones anyway, Barney replied. Your customers are a problem to us. We won't tell you who you can serve, but we have intelligence that verifies that one of your customers is a high-value target of ours. Eliminating him would be a great benefit to our cause, said Le Choix. Your cause? Asked Barney. What about my bar? We'll fund a rebuild and ensure more than adequate advertising to make sure your clientele doubles, replied Le Choix. Doubles at a minimum, added the smaller Frigainian. Ow, asked Barney, but it was too late. The door began to press open. Geila, who had been sitting by her lonesome at her desk pretending not to eavesdrop the whole time, rushed to the door. Not quite ready to open yet, fellas, she said, pushing her hand through the door and making sure it couldn't open further. Barney and the Frigaine knew she had been listening at that moment. We'll come back soon with details, said Le Choix. For now, we won't disturb your business. We thank you for your consultation. Do you mind if we... Le Choix hung on the end of the word. It took him a moment, but Barney eventually realized what Le Choix wanted to say, but was being too polite not to. He relented and nodded his head toward the back door again. The two Frigaine from the other night must have informed him of how they made good their escape, and now it was looking like every Frigaine and his Cacrion wanted to use the back door. What have you gotten us into? Asked Geila after the first two visitors had left. Us? Replied Barney. You know this place is my sanctuary, she said. If it goes... Boom! The door thudded open. Double for early opens, said a rowdy, already inebriated Sniverin from the rocky planet of Bisborn. His attitude was typical for his species. They drank harder than most, which meant it was going to be a long shift, and Barney sighed at the thought of it. Double or nothing, he said to the jovial Sniverin. Double it then! The Sniverin screamed, followed by a rowdy cheer from the 25 or so other Sniverin accompanying him. The whole crew of a trader ship had deboarded, so it was going to be big payday for Barney. For Geila, too. But as a second ship of the Sniverin convoy began to descend onto the asteroid, it was met by a blue ray of superheated energy from a cloaked position that sent it hurtling into the dust of the space rock in an uncontrolled descent of fire and wreckage. No! Screamed the leader of the crew as he rushed to the window to watch in horror as the aftermath of an explosion that had ripped through his kinsman's ship began to send wreckage and desecrated Sniverin cadavers floating through the zero-gravity space like a helium balloon let go by a child. The memory of the childhood balloon came back to Barney as he watched the drama. An unusual, happy thought in a moment of madness. Limbs and organs slowly plopped and pattered back onto the space rock, staining the stones with blood and displacing the black soot of the asteroid after having reached the rim of the envirodome before slowly being pulled back down the gravitational stabilizer. The Sniverins, sombered by the drama, all funneled out of the bar as quickly as they had entered to aid, or rather salvage, what they could of their exploded brothers. "Fuck," said Barney as the realization of what was unfolding dawned on him. Geila stared at him with her sclera-less eyes pinned on his. She wanted him to understand the chaos he was inviting into the bar, but in this time, in this place, she was unable to voice her concerns, lest those who would have been listening invite further madness upon them. Just then, two Sin entered, snickering and snarling and laughing amongst themselves as the still frantic Sniverin rushed past them. It would have been easy for Barney to instantly dismiss the massacre as the Frigaine sending him a message, but the presence of the two Sin now complicated his conclusions. "Two benders," demanded one of the Sin as he pounded his fist on the table, ignoring the drama behind the walls of the bar. "We're celebrating." In no position to make accusations, Barney obliged the Sin with the expensive liquor. They looked out the window and laughed again at the misfortune of the Sniverin, and when they turned back to the drinks, Barney noticed the smaller Frigainian standing off in the distance of the carnage from under the lisp of a cave as a third Sniverin cruiser from the convoy began to descend. The smaller Frigainian held eye contact with Barney as the ship touched down without incident, its own staff adding to the aid of the Sniverin already attending to their fallen brothers. The celebrations had turned into condolences, and it was going to be a task keeping the Sin civil during the somber mood that was sure to follow after the urgency of the incident had been cleared. With the safe touchdown of the second shift, surely the incident would have been passed off as an accident. The Sniverin didn't know of the politics unfolding behind the closed doors at Barney's, and so long as the Sin and the Frigainian kept their mouths shut, whichever one had committed this atrocity would be free from Sniverin retribution. Barney had to try to throw off their suspicions, lest a third player enter their game, and so he ejected the two Sin after having finished their drink. "Not this ship, fellas. Spread the word. We're closed today." Expressions of aggression, frustration, and rage stifled the two Sin's faces. "Finish up and go," he insisted before they could complain. He put down the clean glass and the dirty tea towel, and reluctantly went outside to aid the Sniverin as Geila closed the doors behind the Sin and set the beacon for closed. Undoubtedly, the Sniverin would want to mourn their dead crew brothers before taking off for a more formal burial and medical protocols, and so Barney obliged them by waving the early doubles and leaving the beacon set to close as the Sniverin teetered back for a private moment of somber remembrance to collect themselves and reset their adrenal surges from their urgency that had now passed. "Maybe I should take that deal," he thought as he watched the Sniverin holler in grief and fall into their depressive post-slaughter slump before leaving, having gifted him a trinket from the wreckage as thanks for his keeping the bar closed so they could collect themselves, both figuratively and literally. Geila left her desk and sat at the bar with Barney. "Do you think it was the Sin?" she asked. "Could be," he replied. "Could be the Frigaine as well." They both sat for a moment in contemplation and suspicion. "Maybe you should just let them have him," said Geila, as the Sniverin's wailing curled through the air and punched against the window as they passed the wreckage of the fallen ship one last time. The rest of the patrons followed suit in a united mourning cry for their needlessly fallen brothers. Their voices combined, the windows began to rattle. "Maybe," said Barney. "But what if we're wrong?" "So be it," replied Geila. "Do you think what happens here is enough to affect the outcome of the war?" Decisions, he said to Geila, with a sigh underpinning his words. "Do I hand her over to the warlord doing dirty deals out the back and keep my loyal customers? Or do I hand him over and hope the Frigaine keep their word and provide better ones?" It was a rhetorical question. Barney snarled, not unkindly and not at Geila, but at the possibilities of the answers to her question. "Take over for a bit," he said, and dropped a rag on the bar top. He went out the back and sat smoking a chem plume. The LED light at the end slowly strobed red as the device warmed up, then turned green once it was ready to inhale. He took a big draw on the device and inhaled deeply, holding his breath for a moment and then exhaling deeply to both release the smoke captured in his lungs and to release the stress pent up from the ongoing developments. The plume wandered up to the very top of the envirodome before dispersing against it and fogging it up for a moment. Were the Syn's arms deal so bad? He thought. A few arms here or there so they can fight for their cause. He had to find out. He sent Geila a text prompt. I'm taking the rest of the shift off. Finish up for me. Rest of the shift's takings are yours. He strapped on a secondary skin breather, grabbed a buggy and a short-range bucket gun that one of the Syn had sold him, and went off to see what was happening in the shadows of the asteroid A6160719-Delta. Chapter 4. When he arrived, he was amazed at what he found. An entire marketplace had been organized, operating in the silence of open atmospheric space. He marveled at the sheer number of shoppers present at the bazaar. If even half of them visited his bar after, he'd make a killing. Then he realized that perhaps the asteroid was more known for the weapons market than for his bar. He couldn't be sure how the shoppers were communicating. Was it across internal radio bandwidths or some other form of low-tech? He was certain they were communicating, though. Deals like what he was watching had to be negotiated somehow. There was never a set price, and furthermore, how else could they have manufactured such a thriving enterprise? The Syn and other interplanetary visitors looked at him as he stumbled through the marketplace. Some knew who he was, and their eyes glued to him with questions that they would never be able to ask. Some Snivrin, uninvolved or attached to the early incident, were there, and even a new Nostalgi. There were 2 human males who had never visited the bar before, who looked surprised to see another human trotting about. There were Kogar and Feldors, Kiltums and Hieldi. Even the royal high-class Eltriskians were there. The ones he saw with their silken robes draped over their spinal humps were selling a cell devastator to a hulking Syn at an exorbitant price. The Syn looked at Barney as he handed the currency card to the delicate Eltriskian and continued with the transaction. What's your refund policy? Barney thought as he continued past the highly illegal deal. After a while, the market-goers went back to their dealings, heeding Barney no attention as they wrongfully assumed there was no issue. He soon realized this was because none of them were personally responsible for what had sprouted up on the back of his beloved rock in the sun, and so it was plausible they thought that Barney was aware and on board with the illegal arms market installation. Finally, he reached the end of the main corridor. Sitting atop a throne of rusted iron sat Mel Kayani, a high-ranking Syn warlord who regularly visited the bar and was one of those customers. Ah, fuck, thought Barney as he realized who was heading this operation. In place of the ability to communicate verbally, a nod was exchanged between the warlord and the bartender, whose land he had purloined to undertake illicit businesses on. Barney looked down and shook his head in disgust, turning his back on the Syn warlord. The warlord made a gesture with his hands as Barney turned to leave, and 2 smaller Syns stepped in front of Barney's path. The disappointed bartender turned his head in anger to meet the gaze of Melkani's disrespect. Barney's eyebrows were furrowed and his jaw visibly tightened through his secondary skin breather. He snarled without sound, and silently a dozen rounds sprayed at the abdomens of the 2 Syn henchmen barring his path. Probably half of those rounds ricocheted off the hardened skin plates of the thugs, but the other half found their way between the grooves at close range, tearing through their organs and spraying a mist of that watered-down ketchup blood as far as the end range of the gravity nullifier would allow it to go, before either pulling it back down to the rock or letting it rise until it stuck to the top of the envirodome. There would be no washing off the drops that rose to the very top, and as Barney made his way back to his buggy, he realized that the dome would now be forever stained with their DNA. It's gonna cost a fortune to get that shit cleaned off, he thought, as he initiated the start sequence of the buggy. He turned his head and noticed a lone Syn, whom he hadn't dealt with in the past, watching him from atop a dune. The Syn was not trying to hide his presence. He was very visible. Barney continued to observe him through the rearview mirror of the buggy as he began to slowly pull away from his parked position, and as he did, He noticed a second, and then a third sin had accompanied the lone merchant on top of the dune to watch Barney pull away. Fuck 'em, he thought as he began to mentally outline the options available to him now that he had established what was really going on. One option in particular stood out most prominently in his mind. The door to the bar slammed open, and as he entered, Geila's eyes were on him. She reached out her arm to Barney, but he shook it away and went directly to the bar, where he partook in his subconscious stress reliever of vigorously cleaning an already clean glass with an already dirty rag. "Bar," she tried to say, but he turned away. The sin entered. He recognized the first one as the one who had been watching him leave the firearms marketplace from atop the dune. They quietly shuffled into the bar and took up their seats silently. Barney walked over to them. He didn't say a word and just nodded and raised his eyebrows to them, pretending as though nothing had just transpired. Melchiani walked in and took his seat amongst the sin. Barney repeated the gesture. Melchiani tunneled through the barkeeper with his gaze, fully aware of the Carnavax in the room, but refusing to acknowledge it. "The usual," said Melchiani, more cautiously than usual, and Barney pivoted on one foot and walked away to fetch the order. He returned to the tables a moment later. He began placing the drinks in front of the sin, starting at the lowest ranking and making his way through to the top ranking, before leaving the table having not delivered Melchiani's drink at all. This was a blatant fuck you in sin culture, one which Barney was sure had been noticed. Melchiani growled under his breath as the sin sat drinking, each looking as if he was forced to be there against his own fruition. Melchiani sat drinkless amongst his kin as their eyes darted across the various places of the bar, and Barney relished in their awkwardness he had created until two Frigaine entered. As if sensed by some unknown primal instinct, every sin weapon was drawn on the door. "He smelled them coming or something," Barney thought. He came out from the bar and put his arm around one of the Frigaines. It wasn't Lichois or any Frigaine he had seen in the bar before, but their attire denoted they were of the military leagues. "Come on in, friends," he said as he walked with the two soldiers to a chair, making intense eye contact with Melchiani along the way. The two Frigaine soldiers were noticeably on edge as they took their place. "Don't worry," Barney assured them. "This isn't a war zone." The Frigaine and the sin eyed each other from across their tables. He took the soldiers' orders and returned promptly with an excessive amount of customer service that had been missing when serving the sin. He bent over to whisper something to one of the Frigaine, making sure to point overtly at the sin, and particularly Melchiani, ending the interaction by informing the Frigaine very loudly that if they wished to purchase illegal arms, there was a very well-stocked marketplace on the other side of the asteroid. The sin's table was upended over in a moment, and suddenly the Carnavax in the room had finally been addressed, as Melchiani walked over to Barney and the Frigaine with his oversized plasma extinguisher drawn and aimed directly at them. The Frigaine soldiers raised their hands. Always outnumbered, thought Barney as he took the opportunity to make good use of the situation he had purposely manipulated at the two Frigaine's expense. "You're not in a delegated battle zone," one said. "This will be murder." Melchiani grunted and pulled the trigger as a flash of light pulsed from the nozzle of the weapon, firing the searing heat of a sun focused into a single point on the Frigaine's head, turning it into a mist of liquid biomatter particles. "Idiot," said Barney as he drew his own weapon on Melchiani. The two stood glaring at each other, weapons drawn as they walked closer to one another and eventually placed the nozzles of their weapons to one another's heads. Neither dared even blink. Chest to chest, they spoke through gritted teeth, and there was a push, a shove, and a hush came over the bar as Barney stumbled back. The small human righted himself and calmly walked over to the Sin warlord. The last remaining Frigaine tried to take the opportunity to leave, but a thick Sin hand had found its way to his shoulder and sat him down in his place.
Barney returned to his position at the chest of Melchiani, avoiding eye contact until thwack! The fist landed hard on the chiseled jaw of the Sin Warlord and damn near broke every bone in Barney's hand. To everyone's surprise, the Sin Warlord dropped to his knee. It was a good punch. Unexpectedly good, given the height Barney had to accommodate to land it. He didn't even know he had it in himself. "Back room," he snarled to the Warlord merchant and pushed the thick door to the kitchen open. The kitchen was almost unused. Everything was made from a polished stainless steel that hadn't been cleaned in years, and there was a refrigerator with a solid, heavy door in the back corner with a lock and latch on it. There was a stove with the ability to burn with at least 300,000 BTU of heat, with an exhaust fan hovering over the top to catch the vapors, the chimney of which rose kilometers into the ceiling of the Envirodome, high above the building where it met against a one-way return adapter vent so that it could vent freely into space without having the vacuum of space vent in. Melchiani eyeballed his surroundings, understanding that it was probably the first time a patron had ever set foot in the back room. Post-mixed tubes and hoses ran from the cardboard boxes to their designated taps back at the bar, an ancient technique which, itself, was to be marveled at its authenticity. "I should promote this authenticity," thought Melchiani, as he tried to translate the writing on the boxes of alien syrups. "I want a cut," said Barney, not wasting any time, and the Sin Warlord glared at the barman. 10%, he replied. 50, answered Barney. 20, 35, and then, finally, 30. Deal, they finally agreed. The stubby palm of the barkeep clasped the thick, scaly wrist of the armor-skinned Sin Warlord, and the deal was done. Barney pointed at a vid recorder in the corner. "It records audio too," he said. "No backing out," repeated Melchiani. 30% to you, and we continue our business, unmolested. Unmolested, Barney repeated. Back in the bar, the eyes of the Sin and Geila were stuck to the thick rubber door of the backroom kitchen, like rom-com in a Lycran Farbrex fur rug. Their anticipation was finally answered, but only by silence when Barney and Melchiani returned to the main bar. There was no rejoicing, no celebrating, no smiles of friendship renewed, just cold silence, as the quizzical eyes of all present watched Barney go to the bar to start rubbing those already gleaming glasses with that already atrociously dirty rag. Melchiani took a seat as though nothing happened. Trade was about to return to normal when the Frigaine, who had been held in his place by the grip of a stronger Sin, was violently dispatched from the bar with a well-placed shot from an old Centennian neutron pistol. The arc cracked across the room before making its way to the red dot placed unknowingly on the Frigaine's head, before searing a very neat, well-placed hole from the front to the back. He slumped dead in his seat, and the two Sin holding him in place stared at Barney as wisps of smoke rose regally to the ceiling, barely threatening to trigger the smoke alarms. "Get him out of here," said Barney, and the two Sin guards looked over at Melchiani, who nodded, allowing them to undertake Barney's request. Geila left her table and slowly sauntered over to Barney behind the bar. "I guess you know now," she asked rhetorically. "I didn't know how big it was. Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked. "I guess no one realized how fast it was growing, and no one wanted you to put an end to it," she said. "Not even you?" asked Barney. She stared at the floor without comment. "Well, it's going to end," he said, and she raised her gaze in confusion. "They're okay with that? You just told him, cut it out, and he's going to listen." Barney's eyebrows dipped and one corner of his lip raised. "They don't know," he said. "They don't know? Barney, they'll kill you when they—" "It's okay," he interrupted. "I'm going to take 30%, he admitted. 30%? You're going into business with them? "Nah," he said. "I'm just taking their money. I'm going into business with the Frigaine." Chapter 5. Several cycles had passed, and things went as well as they could. Barney kept away from the Sin's arms market on the dark side of the rock, and Melchiani quietly delivered his 30% every so often, as agreed. One shift, not too long after their mutual agreement, a pair of Frigaines had entered the bar, and as always, as if instinctual, the Sin had raised their weapons to greet their ancient enemies at the door. Barney stepped out from behind the bar. "Easy, boys. You know the rules." Some of the Sin looked at him dismayed. "The war doesn't happen here," he reiterated, as Melchiani sat back and watched, somewhat taken aback by Barney's rebuke. It was out of character with their new fond agreement, so Melchiani continued to watch Barney. "I need to speak to Lishwa," he whispered to the Frigaine, with a higher authority ranking tattooed on his neck. "Tell him I'm in." Who?" asked the Frigaine. Barney tapped him on the shoulder, leaving the conversation there. For the remainder of the shift, the Sin drank and grew rowdy, whilst, as always, the Frigaine sat timidly, away from the rowdy environment, unable to relax in the presence of their enemies. Later, when Melchiani was as pliable as he was ever going to be, Barney went back over to the two Frigainians and filled their cups. "These two are on the house," he said. "The one I tap on the shoulder is the one Leash was after, I think." The two Frigaine were confused, but took note as Barney went over to the congregation of Sin, who had slowly been becoming the majority patronage in the bar, ever since the gentleman's business agreement was made in the kitchen. He placed a hand on Melchiani's shoulder as a gesture of friendship to mask his treachery, and he filled his glass to further signal it to the Frigaine. He made eye contact with the Frigaine to ensure they understood, then left to go and attend to any other duties that required attending to, so long as they required a dirty tea towel. When he got to the bar, he noticed one of the Sin, the one who had come out to watch him drive off from the weapons market during the shift where the kitchen deal was made, was staring at him. "What the fuck is with this one?" Barney thought to himself as he stared back at the unknown Sin, and made his way over to Geila's desk to try and break the Sin's awkward gaze that was triggering emotional cues of caution. "Are they okay in here?" she asked, referring to the two Frigainians who were sitting at the far end of the venue. "They're fine," Barney assured her as he watched them fidget and converse quietly with each other, the whole time moving their eyes from the Sin, then to Barney and back again, almost in trained unison to not draw attention to themselves whilst taking in every detail of their surroundings. It was like watching two rabbits drinking in a lion's den. He wondered if lions and rabbits still even existed. "Fuck it," he said to Geila, and he walked over to the two Frigaine and leaned over their table. "Go out the back door," he said. "You'll be safe, but remember," he added, "tell Lishwa, the one I tapped. You saw which one, right?" The two Frigaine looked at each other before the more senior one nodded to Barney. "Go on the cue," he said as he walked over to the party of Sin. "All right, everyone, it's 5 o'clock. There was a roar of excitement from the Sin at the announcement, and they raised their glasses with a cheer. Barney turned up the volume on the music box, dimmed the lights, and the atmosphere changed. After a moment, the awkwardness of the Sin and the Frigaine had passed, and as the lights dimmed even further and the room filled with smoke, the Frigaine made their exit without being noticed by the Sin. Melchiani, however— "Why do you always let them live?" he asked Barney, as Barney caught him watching the back door close behind the two Frigaine. "Return trade," Barney replied, and Melchiani grunted at the uncomfortable side effect of the deal they had made. "Why are you fighting them anyway?" asked Barney. Melchiani leaned back and stuck the nail of his thumb between his teeth, trying to scrape something from between them away. "They're trying to acquire our home for resources," he said over the roar of the music, though not shouting. These types of conversations weren't for being spoken in shouts. "What have you got that they need?" asked Barney. Melchiani laughed, insinuating, "What don't we have?" "Weapons," he said with a chuckle. In response to the irony, Barney picked up a random half-full glass from the table and clinked it against Melchiani's to celebrate their good fortune found in such an unfortunate irony. "I'll drink to that," he said, and took a swig before instantly spraying it violently out of his mouth and nose. "Bloody hell," he said. "How do you drink that shit?" The congregation of Sin laughed at Barney's inability to ingest their indigenous beverage, which was several levels higher on the toxicity chart and content scale that was acceptable for human consumption. "In copious amounts," said Melchiani, as he patted Barney on the back and finished a full glass in one gulp. Chapter 6. As the sun rose over the horizon of the rock, the Sin and other stragglers were awoken from their drunken stupors by the warm rays pressing through the thickened glass of the Envirodome, which created a rainbow effect on some of the bar's more translucent surfaces. There was a snort and a grunt from the first Sin awake. He gently nudged the others, and they slowly shuffled out of the bar with their heads down and hands up to block out the glare of the asteroid's solar rotation. Barney jerked himself awake at the sound of the bell on the door ringing as the Sin left the building.
"Later, fellas,"
he mumbled as he fixed himself a cup of water. Geila was walking downstairs with her client from the last shift. She bowed her head in thanks and sent the Slytherin on his way before looking over at Barney. He had finished the water and was working on brewing something that looked like a potion of mud that Geila had never seen before. "What's that?" she asked.
"I'll drink from home. It's called coffee, and it's really hard to get out here," he said. "Want some?"
She shrugged and went over for a sip. "Oh my," she said as she grimaced. "It's so bitter."
"Meant to be good for hangovers,"
said Barney. "I bet," replied Geila. "And who is that?" she asked as she gestured with her eyes to the back entry of the bar.
"Lishwa,"
said Barney as he walked over to the Frigaine visitor standing in the doorway. "I've heard you've decided to take my offer," he said to Barney, not offering any gesture of greeting and keeping the interaction overly formal.
"I have,"
he replied. "Good," said Lishwa. "Your aid will be a great asset to our cause."
"I just want my rock back,"
said Barney, and he ushered the Frigaine to the back of the bar where he pointed outwards.
"They've set up an arms market out there,"
he told Lishwa. The Frigainian scoffed at the information that had been common knowledge to everyone but Barney. "We know," he said. "We've known for a long time."
"Then why didn't you say anything?"
asked Barney. "How would that help us?" asked Lishwa, rhetorically.
"They've offered me a deal to keep it going,"
said Barney. "See that you do," replied Lishwa. "It will buy us some time to gather intel on our target." Barney rubbed his dry, tired, crusted eyes.
"The one I pointed out to you guys?"
he asked Lishwa, who looked at him but held back an answer until he could find an appropriate one in the constant game of interplanetary politic chess he played when divulging information to those pieces on the board. Too much information, and he could be checkmated. "Classified," he finally settled on, causing Barney to roll his eyes.
"So, how's this going to work then?"
"Keep your current stance," said Lishwa. "We'll send random agents out at random intervals for you to report to. Until then, as far as the Sin know, you're somewhere in the middle between us and them."
"Not a problem,"
said Barney.
"But how'll I know which ones I'm clear to talk to?"
he asked Lishwa. "How did you know to tell the other two?" he asked Barney.
"I didn't,"
said Barney. Lishwa gave Barney a knowing smirk that enabled Barney to piece it all together.
"They're all cleared,"
he realized. He passed Lishwa the cup of coffee. "What's this?"
"A human treatise beverage," said Barney.
"We drink it to celebrate when we seal a deal." Lishwa took a sip, and the closest cabinet to him was covered in hot, browny black liquid soup, in the same fashion Barney had covered the table in the Sin's indigenous brew the shift before.
"It's an acquired taste,"
he said to Lishwa. "I bet," Lishwa replied. "My apologies," he said, "but my Frigainian oral sensors are—" Barney laughed.
"All good,"
he said, patting the Frigaine on the shoulder.
"Send your guys, and we'll get these bastards."
Lishwa nodded and officially set the double play in motion. Chapter 7. The Sin didn't come to the bar the following shift, or the shift after that, or the shift after that. The Frigaine agents had made an appearance once and appeared unimpressed when Barney had nothing to report. It would be 14 shifts before the Sin would finally return to Barney's establishment, and when they did, it would be in spectacular fashion. The door burst open loudly as they staggered in, covered in blood, wounded, holding each other up and out of breath. Geila left her table and instantly began attending to the injured Sin, stumbling through the door. Some were completely covered in needles and spines from head to toe. Normally, their thick-plated skin would adequately deflect such thin, weak munitions, but here they were stuck neatly and deeply into the bioplating of the Sin, as if expertly placed by a malicious needle doctor. But how? She thought as she began to pick the needles out one by one from the first Sin she had attended. The sin withered and seethed with every pluck as tiny droplets of blood drizzled down his hardened skin. If she removed the wrong one, he could bleed out. "What happened?" she asked the warrior-turned voodoo doll.
"Frigaine,"
he replied. Malchione walked in on the tail end of the comment, his own body riddled with the spindly needle munitions and other fragmented pieces of shrapnel. Barney had begun ushering patrons to the other side of the bar to spare them the view of the battle trauma. It was bad customer service to showcase the aftermath of a massacre to his patrons, but business was business, and Barney didn't want to lose any.
"We were ambushed,"
said Malchione as he stumbled over the threshold of the bar, and suddenly a roar echoed through the bar as a pressure wave pushed on the walls, shaking the floor and making some of the glasses hanging over the bar fall from their hooks and shatter across the floor and into the sink.
"They followed us,"
screamed Malchione as Barney peered out to see a new crater in the rock where the Sin's primary ship had been.
"This must be it,"
thought Barney as he watched the black plumes of smoke rise and disperse against the top of the Envirodome.
"They're in the dome,"
said one of the Sin as they gathered themselves and tried to rally. The one Geila was working on ceased accepting her aid and rose with his brothers.
"To the market,"
he said.
"We can rearm there."
And suddenly, the one thing that no one ever spoke of was open for discussion.
"No,"
said Barney.
"Just wait a second."
He tried to calm the distraught warriors who were clearly still being driven by adrenaline.
"You're at Barney's,"
he said.
"Let me sort this out."
And he went to the door armed with his trusty tea towel. He stepped out of his beloved bar to find a full platoon of Frigaine soldiers standing proudly just beyond the wreckage of the Sin's ride home.
"You know the rules,"
he said.
"Lishwa would have told them to you."
"This is war," said the Frigaine commander.
"A war which doesn't apply here,"
replied Barney.
"Now, unless you're coming in for a drink."
He let the Frigaine commander figure it out for himself and turned away, slowly walking back to the bar, expecting a needle to pierce his back with every step forward. A needle that never came. And so, after what felt like an eternity, he finally made it back, even though it had been only moments, and once there, he waited.
"Sit,"
he said to the Sin. They looked at him.
"Sit,"
he said again, far more sternly, and a moment later, the door opened. One by one, the Frigaine entered silently. At first, the Sin jostled and went to make for their weapons as they usually did.
"Sit,"
Barney said again.
"Leave him outside,"
Barney said to the Frigaine. "What about theirs?" asked their commander as he pointed to the decimated group of Sin struggling to aim their weapons at their Frigaine enemies.
"Do you think they're really in a position to hurt you right now?"
Barney asked. And so, in a well-rehearsed fashion, they began to pass their firearms to the soldier behind them until they were all disarmed, as Barney prompted the Sin to lower theirs, as Geila went around and gathered them all up.
"Welcome,"
said Barney, as the Frigaine awkwardly shuffled past the Sin, taking their seats at the opposite side of the venue. The whirring of engines started out dim, but rose too quickly for anyone to be able to react to what followed next. The air hatch of the Envirodome opened, and before anyone could turn around to see what was happening, the Frigaine battle frigate was beyond the confines of the dome and spacebound. Everyone looked out the window as the ship sped off, except for Malchione.
"Looks like we're having a sleepover,"
said Barney, and the Frigaine commander drew a concealed weapon from a holster under a piece of fabric draped over his chest, but Barney was too quick. The short-range bucket gun sang its hymn as the chorus of its bullets sprayed the chest cavity of the Frigainian commander. He took a step back to absorb the munitions, then slumped forward as the foreign objects had just entered his body, distorted its natural capacity to maintain life, and permanently cut the cycle of his short. Blood spurted and sprayed for a moment until the pressure in the Frigainian commander's body dropped to zero, and his alien circulatory system came to a halt. There was silence.
"So, who's in charge now?"
grunted the voice of one of the Sin, and every eye on both sides scanned the room for the next authority figure to take command. The standoff was palpable, and the bar was one word, one movement away from erupting into a high-pressure hose of runny ketchup and copper blood.
"Looks like I am,"
Barney finally said.
"And it's gonna be a long night."
Chapter 8. With Melchiane having absconded with the Frigaine's battle frigate, and the commander of the Frigaine platoon embalmed in his frozen bodily fluids in a refrigerator out the back of Barney's kitchen, the bar was always a breath away from carnage, as the two opposing sides patiently complied with Barney's forced tolerance, which in turn forced Barney to explore his options. One in particular had crossed his mind several times, a plausible solution that would free him from his trappings and buy him his safety, possibly even Geila's. Barney was contemplating what was once unthinkable to him. He was going to close the bar. "But that will just keep them stuck here," said Geila.
"Yeah, but we'll be gone," he said. "If I keep it open and they kick off, others could get hurt as well."
"But how are we going to get out of here?" she asked. "If you close it up, both sides will know something's wrong, and if they stay here to kill each other, one day, eventually, they'll catch up with us."
"I can't actually keep the war out of this place, you know," he said. "You and I both know that realistically, they can shoot the shit out of this place, and there's nothing we can do about it."
"We're calling their bluff," said Geila.
"We?"
asked Barney. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's always been we," she replied, as he shrugged her hand off his shoulder. "You're stuck with me, with or without this place," she added with a smile. He murmured something under his breath, but it didn't dissuade her from displaying her emotions openly. Emotions he was uncomfortable with. There were only a few patrons left in the bar who were neither Frigaine or Sin, and so he waited patiently for them to leave, setting subtle gestures like yawning at their table and failing to approach them to refill their glasses, so that his body language would tell them to fuck off, where his words could not. Because after all, business was business, and if there were chances of coming out of this intact, whereas as slim as Ice Cube's chance in a star, he'd need customers to return to. After the bar was empty, but for the awkward slumber party buddies, Barney stood atop the bar and was about to make an announcement when he saw a familiar figure enter the room.
"Leshwa,"
he said as he looked down at the new guest. The Frigainian's eyes raised as he took the scene before him.
"Let's have a chat out back,"
said Barney as he stepped down from the bar top and walked out the back with Leshwa. He couldn't help but notice the Sin appeared uneasy with what they were watching unfold between Leshwa and Barney began to suspect that they were becoming aware of his plans.
"Betrayer!"
one shouted, unable to contain himself.
"Oh, hush," said Barney. "It's just business talk. I could have this chat with Melchiane, but he seems to have fucked off with your lover's ticket home."
The Sin growled with contempt.
"Nah, betrayer,"
said Barney in a whimper as he walked off with Leshwa, leaving the Sin to stew in his mockery.
"Fucking overdramatic."
His words wafted off into nothing as they made their way into the kitchen.
"Hey, and don't kill each other while I'm gone,"
he said unexpectedly, peeping his head past the door jamb to mention the obvious.
"If you do, I'll know."
In the kitchen, Barney opened the freezer at the far end. "Oh, Commander Yituda," said Leshwa. "Why is he in your freezer?"
"Well, you see, the darndest thing happened."
"Spare me," said Leshwa. Phew, thought Barney, grateful that he didn't have to explain what had happened, but decided he should anyway.
"Your lot attacked the Sin."
"Is that confirmed?" asked Leshwa, before he allowed Barney to continue.
"Well, that's the Sin side of the story. I haven't asked your mob. I'm trying to keep the peace right now. Otherwise, there won't be a bar for your guy to come back to."
"Is he here now?" asked Leshwa.
"Maybe,"
said Barney.
"He might be among that lot, but the one I told you about is fucked off with your guy's ticket home."
Leshwa glared at Barney. "Where is he?" he asked, his patience running thin.
"Gone,"
said Barney.
"I don't know where. Was he a target?"
asked Barney. "That's confidential," replied Leshwa. Suddenly, there was a thwapping sound of blunt force trauma hitting soft bone. After the surprise of the sound, Barney checked around his immediate area to see if anyone else had been lurking that may have heard it. "What are you doing?" asked Barney as Leshwa's lifeless body sank dully to the ground. "Help me," whispered Geila as she hit the limp body again and again. Barney took a quick look around to make sure one more time that nobody else was lurking, then began hitting the Frigaine alongside Geila to make sure her handiwork was correct. He took a heavy box down from the shelf and dropped it on top of Leshua's head. The sound of breaking glass clanged and echoed well past the kitchen walls, and Barney cursed under his breath, thinking that the whole bar must have heard it and that someone would be around soon to investigate. "Well, they're going to know now," whispered Geila. "Fuck," said Barney. He peered his face around the corner of the door leading to the bar the same way as he'd done earlier to remind the two conflicting parties not to kill each other. "All good, everyone," he said. "Just some technical issues." All the eyes in the bar, on both sides, were watching the doorway where the smashing sound had emanated from as he went back to committing murder in the kitchen. "They're oddly disciplined," said Geila. "They think Leash was going to get him out of here," he said. "We can't let him know he's dead, but at the same time, we need to." "But if we do, they'll know we killed him," said Geila. "Well, this is all me killed you do, Guy," said Barney. "Because he was a threat to you," said Geila. "Lishwa wasn't a threat. You were just talking." "Yes, we were, until you came in and caved his fucking head in. What do you do that for?" he asked her. "I thought I had a plan," she said. "Great fucking plan," said Barney. "All right, help me. I have an idea." Barney went back out to the bar. "I don't have any more room in the fridge," he said to everyone. With a struggle, he held the body of Leshwa up for all to see before letting it drop behind the bar. The Sin smirked, scoffed, and chuckled at the demise of another one of their enemies. Aware of the gentleman's agreement with Barney, they assumed they had an unspoken upper hand against the Frigaines in this predicament. They may have misinterpreted Barney's act of violence as a gesture of good faith to honor their agreement in lieu of Melchiani's absence, but Barney would correct their misconceptions. His eyebrow raised at the Sin's disrespect towards the Frigaine, and without warning, a shot rang out as the Sin groaned in pain with the innards of his chest spilling onto the floor in front of him. Geila had picked up on Barney's subtle eyebrow cue and acted appropriately, as they had planned. "Bit more even now," she said, clearing up the Sin's misunderstanding. "No sides," said Barney. "I've tried to keep you both from killing each other. I've tried to keep this war out of my bar, but all I got is a fucking weapons market out the back and fucking exploding ships out the front." The two sides looked at each other as the realization of Barney's true efforts to stay impartial dawned on them. The silence wasn't awkward, merely thoughtful, as everyone in the bar wondered if everyone else was thinking the same thing, but none spoke it, just in case someone wasn't, until eventually a Sin soldier broke the silence. "Melchiani will betray us," he said, and Barney looked over at the random warrior quizzically. He wasn't random. Barney recognized this one. He had seen him before. "Me, more than us," the random Sin warrior continued to say as he pushed his chair away from the table and stood up. The rest of the Sin seemed to bow their heads humbly as he spoke, not in servitude, but in respect, almost as if in condolences. "Who are you?" asked Barney. "Neptun," said the Sin warrior, and suddenly hushed murmurs befell the Frigaine platoon. One went to stand, but his comrade sat him down forcefully. But, he started. "No," said the comrade. "But we could win." "No," said the same man. His single-word sentence silenced the Frigaine in his place. "I've seen you before," Barney said to Neptun. "Yes," replied Neptun. "On the mount at the market." Barney then had a deeper realization of what had occurred that evening, and recognized that he would have to choose his words more wisely when dealing with this one. He benched his anxiety for a moment to partake in the mental gymnastics of the intergalactic political chess game that was unraveling in his bar. "It's you they want," he said, "not Melchiani." "Yes," blurted out the Frigaine, who had stood up earlier, and once again his minder pressed him back into his chair. The handler then stood up to speak. "Our Frigaine brothers will send a welfare check if we don't respond to our check-ins, and if those who come to check on us also go missing, another will come," said the one who continued to speak out of turn before once again being silenced by his superior. "And then finally, a battle fleet." He finished from his seat, his senior rolling his eyes at his own inability to control his Frigaine comrade.
They might send the fleet first if Melchiades sells me out to them, said Neptune.
Regardless, if we have been in your presence for too long, said the Frigainian soldier.
Meaning?
Asked Barney. Meaning, when they send a fleet, they'll use us as traitors and do unto us as they will do unto them, he said, pointing at Neptune.
Traitors?
Asked Barney.
For being here?
Yes, said the Frigainian. What excuse could we fabricate for not fighting these sin bastards to our last breath? If they live, and we do also, our doctrines of battle decree us as traitors to our cause. As we sit here now along these bastards, our fate is sealed, one way or the other.
Then fight them with us,
said Neptune.
Melchiades has more likely than not run to your commanders to secure his own hide, rather than run to our brothers to save ours. They wouldn't fire on a Frigainian ship, and he knows that. That buys him time to negotiate for his worthless life. There's no doubt in my mind that he has double-crossed us to your superiors. And with traitors in their midst and such a grand old prize in my bar,
said Barney,
they're a-coming.
So, what are our options? Asked Geila, and the bar fell quiet again, but it was a different silence to the earlier stifling of speech. There was the quiet before the brainstorm, although, to the sin, the answer was already evident, and before long, even the Frigainians had figured it out, except that one, the one who kept speaking out of turn. He sat at his table, fidgeting, until all eyes were on him. What? He asked. Do you understand? Asked the Frigainian, who had seated him earlier. Understand what? Asked the simpleton Frigainian. We are going to have to kill our brothers, said his handler. Oh, replied the light-minded Frigainian sarcastically. Is that all? Chapter 9. The agreement was unspoken, but the plans therein were well communicated, and this would be a remarkable opportunity for alliance if everyone could play their part. How can we beat them? Asked the widely unpopular Frigainian.
Might as well show them,
said Neptune.
And if we're to die in this, then who cares about what we hide?
And with that, a Sin warrior ushered the Frigainian outside. Neptune stood up and gestured for Barney to follow them.
I might as well explain our exploitation of your hospitality,
said Neptune, as the four ventured out beyond the bar to where the streets of covered weapons lay unattended by Sin's salesmen since the bar had closed. Under the Envirodome, at such a far distance from the high-pressure dampeners, there were limited opportunities to communicate, and on that fateful shift when Barney had finally become privy to what was going on right beneath his nose, he was unaware of how such an enterprise could unfold without communications. The thought of how had kept him up at night, scratching at his intrigue. He had assumed a closed-circuit radio channel was active, but they could be intercepted, and he knew the Sin were too clever for that. As they walked past the rows of sheet stalls pegged down to the dust of the asteroid to stop their masks from floating away to the top of the Envirodome, they stopped randomly. Neptune lifted one of the sheets covering the bench top of the stall made from stacked pallets. Weapons of mass destruction was an understatement to the caliber of weapons which lay across the pallet. The Frigainian winced in horror as he realized how close his species was to not only losing the war, but from extinction at the hands of the Sin. Seismic destabilizers stood proudly on their little tripods at the front of the pallet. Atmospheric decomposers were next to them, followed by geomagnets, with their magnetic poles so hyper-focused that the mere activation of one, let alone the hundreds on the pallet, could nullify the electromagnetic field and the magnetic cores of objects in sizes akin to planets. Without those fields, ultraviolet particles would flood the surfaces of those objects, irradiating everything into a de-evolution and or decomposition of physical existence. Such weapons had long been outlawed amongst the civil species of the galaxy, particularly those who had signed up to the Felix Accords, and the Frigainians had never imagined that the technology to bring them to the back life still existed, and yet, here it was, right in front of their stupidest ones' naive eyes. Neptune walked to a shallow cave on the edge of the street and retrieved a rod from therein. He held it out in front of himself, brandishing it like a ceremonial bow before the knighting of a warrior. Barney looked at it. The Frigainian looked at it. Then Neptune flipped it vertically. What grand weapon was this? Thought the Frigainian, hopefully for a demonstration that wouldn't end in his death. Oh shit, thought Barney as he braced himself for the demonstration of the weapon's wrath. Neptune began to twirl the bow in a circular motion. Before long, it was spinning like a propeller, guarding his body in every direction from an attack. Neptune picked up more and more speed from the weapon before slamming it down with force into the dust of the asteroid, and using it to write.
So, what do you think?
He wrote in the fine powdery dust of the asteroid plains. Barney's eyes rolled back as he realized the obvious and jerked the stick away from Neptune.
Fucking asshole,
he wrote in the dust with the stick as Neptune began to laugh silently under his atmospheric stabilizer. The back door to the bar opened and they all stepped back in.
After all this time,
said Barney.
I can't believe that's how you did it for all this time.
Neptune struggled to contain his hysterics at the simple solution that had blinded Barney for so long.
Sometimes the simplest things work the best,
he said after struggling to remove his atmospheric stabilizer.
Credit where it's due,
said Barney. The Frigainian couldn't shake the solemn expression from his face as he rejoined his comrades in the bar. You look like you've seen a ghost, said one. Of all our future generations, he replied. The one who had asked creased his brow. They're weapons, said the naive one.
World enders,
interrupted one of the Sin.
Indeed,
said Neptune.
We suspected, but...
He couldn't finish his thought. All this time, you could have annihilated us so many times over after all this time.
It's true,
said Neptune.
But we are not the savages you take us for.
But why not? Asked the Frigainian.
Because a leader is only worth the quality of his followers,
said Neptune.
Hear, hear,
said one of the Sin as they raised their glasses in a salute to their leader. Though jovial for the moment, the deeper elements of the forced bond were beginning to show cracks, and with the weapons on the table, there were added complications to the forced alliance. What was to stop the Frigainians from stealing the world-ending weapons from the market to use against the Sin, after completely decimating the asteroid? What was really stopping the Sin from simply making the Frigainian extinct? This was existence on the edge of a knife. There can only be peace, the naive Frigainian finally said, and Neptune lifted his gaze from his drink and eyeballed the junior soldier.
Ideally,
he replied,
but your leaders won't have it.
We will, said the Frigainian, regardless of our leaders. The bar quieted again as an impromptu and informal negotiation took place.
Who are you to bargain with me, Frigainian?
Asked Neptune. No one, he replied. Merely a stranded foot soldier.
Then how can you guarantee peace?
Neptune asked. When our comrades come, and they will.
Because fucking Malkayani has led them here,
one of the Sin interrupted. After we kill our brothers, we will become yours, said the Frigainian foot soldier. Neptune thumbed a small intake on his left cheek.
Prove your valor,
he said,
and we will prove our honor.
Chapter 10. That shift, the market was disbanded, or rather stripped bare of its goods as Barney's bar became fortified. Plasma rotor turrets were stationed at every corner. Surface-to-air thermal seekers were mounted on the roof pointing upward, and DNA signature motion sweepers were mounted pointing down. If it were to be death from above, then they would make it rain Frigainian corpses. But if it were to be a forward assault, then a landslide of gore awaited the invaders. The planet enders were stored for safekeeping, but it was agreed that the whereabouts would only be known to Barney, Neptune, Geila, and one Frigainian. The Sin were given back their sucker punch rifles, and the Frigainian their needlers. Magma bombs and ion blades were issued out to both sides, and the Frigainians felt themselves at the disadvantage of having to fight with heavier blades, unfit and improperly designed for their slender structures. Nevertheless, they graciously accepted the enemy weapons as they fought with their internal struggle of having to end their comrades' lives. Geila had resigned herself to the fate that the cards had warned her about,
though she had never expected it to come about in such a dwarf fashion. I didn't think the bar would be important like this, she thought, and decided that she wanted to be a presence for good in her dying days, and so she freely offered her services to anyone who would take comfort from them, until the inevitable had begun. Her work distracted her from the anxiety of the potential loss she was about to face, and after having finally found a place for herself in the galaxy, Barney, however, still refused her offers of professional service, and instead opted to stand behind the bar, rubbing his cups and mugs with a dirty rag.
No use cleaning it now, he thought.
Shift after shift passed, and Barney wondered how much of that time was passing on Earth. He wasn't sure. He'd been away too long. He imagined his home planet and the direction it may have taken in his absence. How old were his parents now? Were they still alive? Whatever happened to the bastards who took him from there? He was daydreaming when there was a thud at the door. Even though it was expected, he was still begrudged to get off his ass and go to the door and see who was there. He peered through the visor to see the bloody corpse of a Sin laying at the mat.
Friend of yours?
He said to Neptune as he walked back to the bar, having not opened the door. Neptune peered through the visor on the entry at the lump of charred and bloodied meat still sizzling on the doormat.
No friend of mine,
he replied as he cocked his weapon.
Positions,
he said loudly as both the Sin and Frigaine went to their allocated defensive posts. Barney stayed behind the bar, scrubbing his cups with a dirty rag.
5 o'clock,
he said, and dimmed the lights. A fraction of a second later, the DNA motion sweepers activated, and thin, red lines scanned the perimeter of the bar as Frigainian foot soldiers were cut down into diagonal portions of cosmic grime. The turrets whirred up next. One of the Frigainians inside the bar slid the door open slightly and tried to enact an escape. A sucker punch round found its way through its skull. The Sin who had shot him made his way to the door and took in the charred remains of his traitor comrade who had been left as a gift by the Frigainian. Back in the safety of the bar, he began stuffing the orifices of the burnt meat puppet with T7 phosphates. He did the same to the Frigainian coward he just shot in the head. Liquid slime dripped out of their eyes, ears, anuses, and gnorts as he strapped one traitor to the inside of the front door and the other to the inside of the back door that lay beyond the kitchen that led out towards the dust dunes.
Fail safe,
he said over the zipping sound of super-focused ions finding the receiving points of their targets.
Good,
said Neptune, and Barney gave him a thumbs up. Geila covered her ears and left her desk to go and stay behind the bar with Barney. The surface-to-air thermal seekers ignited. Frigainian reinforcements were on the way as their craft began raining from the sky, and statistically, one was due to land on the bar at any moment. Proximity alarms whirred and strobes began flashing through the smoke as the envirodome became compromised.
Masks up,
said Barney over the commotion. There would be no time to communicate with sticks in the dust during this, and with the audible communication out of play, body gestures would have to guide everyone on the battlefield. A Frigainian Stratus rocket punched through the ceiling of the bar and detonated in the middle of the dance floor. The stranded allies had planned correctly. The open space would be the most vulnerable part of the bar, affording them little to no cover if anything was to come collapsing down. Now, with the central ceiling collapsed, most of the venue could be used as cover for what was to come next. The first explosion blew the back door out. The Frigainian bomb that had been planted by the clever Sin had worked, but it wasn't enough to keep the reinforcements from storming in. Sucker punch rounds thudded into those who stormed in after the explosion as Leshua's frozen corpse became dislodged from the fridge and skidded across the flattest part of the floor, with its eyes reopened by the forces thrust upon it. There was a brief pause in the fighting as his kingsmen recognized the corpse at their feet. "So that's what happened to Leshua," said one of the first Frigainians to storm the bar. He was met by a rapid volley of needler rounds, and it took a moment for the invaders to understand that the comrades whom they had thought would come running to them as saviors were actually firing on them. The needler rounds had a different effect on the Frigainian. They were designed to find the gaps between the Sin's thick armor like skin. They turned the Frigainian into pin-cushion fountains of sanguine death.
As the Frigaine pushed the Kingsmen back beyond the threshold of the bar, they were able to briefly peer outside, beyond the bottleneck at the exploded rear door, and make the first observation of the numbers stacked against them. "We are grossly outnumbered," one of the Frigainian motioned with his fingers in a universal sign language the Allies had all been forced to use to communicate with each other. Neptune looked to Barney. The front door blew open with the same force as the back, and chunks of Melchiani's corpse were turned into shrapnel that stuck into the brothers he had undoubtedly betrayed to save his own skin. The sucker punch rounds of the Sin rang out and added to the echoes of the chorus of carnage reverberating under the building as the growing atmospheric pressure compromised the integrity of the Envirodome. Barney sat slumped behind his bar, and Geila covering her sensory organs as she screamed silently into his lap. A pebble landed by him, and he looked over. Neptune was trying to get his attention. No words, but the look made it clear. The gesture, even more so. Barney nodded and pushed Geila up from his lap, pulling a sheet of metal over her followed by a heavier beam over that. He pointed downwards, aggressively. "Stay," it meant. Sin and Frigainian from both sides were falling in droves. With no quarter given, the plan quickly succumbed to the sheer masses of manpower aligned against the smaller cluster of forces that aligned itself against the Frigainian war machine. Barney scuttled over scraps of metal, broken glass, and random bar debris as the soot from the burning bodies and asteroid ash kicked up from the constant barrage of percussive forces made the mere act of opening one's mouth more of a choking hazard than the hazards caused by the ordnance raining down on the bar. His mouth was dry, his throat parched. It was hard to swallow. He needed a drink. Neptune made his way over to Barney, and they began to scramble for a trapdoor on the southern edge of the dance floor that led to the underground chamber where Barney had kept his stock for the bar, and now the world-ending weapons. Neptune patted Barney on the shoulder. "Thank you," he gestured as he went to grab a weapon Barney had never seen before. Barney tapped Neptune on the shoulder and pointed to himself, taking the weapon from him. "Me," he gestured. Neptune shook his head and pointed back to himself, trying to grasp the weapon back from Barney. But Barney twisted his body aggressively, keeping it from him. Their hand gesture argument went back and forth for a moment or two, until a Frigainian picked up the weapon from Barney's loose grip. He had snatched it with his aim still focused on Neptune. Neptune took advantage of the Frigainian's aversion to where his weapon had been trained and took the opportunity to run when his gaze was focused on the world ender the Frigainian had snatched from Barney. "Coward," Neptune thought to himself as he ran back up the ladder. He ran past the rubble. What was he running to? Or from? Everyone thought as they saw Neptune headed for the gaping hole in the back wall from where the Frigainian had first started their land assault. Neptune had abandoned his weapons and was running away. With all the smoke, dust, and debris, it was impossible to discern, but it appeared he was running away with something heavy. Perhaps even 2 items, each tucked under his arm. "Planet Enders," thought one of the Sin comrades, watching his leader abscond in defeat. "With the Planet Enders, he will live to fight another day. But we won't." Before he could finish his thought, his balance left him, and he could no longer ascertain up from down, left from right, front from back. He felt himself being pulled up, but to where? His atmospheric extrapolator filled with the cosmic dust of A61607219-Delta. He held his breath. He had no other choice. It was sucked from him, just like his sight was, as the forces of what was happening pushed his ocular organs closed. He wondered if he had been hit. He had. He wondered if it was a new type of Frigainian weapon. It wasn't. He wondered if any of his other comrades were suffering the same fate. They were. He wondered if the new Frigainian allies had betrayed him. They hadn't. He wondered if Neptune had actually left with the Planet Enders. He hadn't. And with the last pulse of intelligent thought, he was able to force the corner of one of his ocular organs open, just enough to see the last thing he would ever see. Lured with saline and grit, he saw a Frigainian frigate speed off out of the critically cracked Envirodome. Space was flooding in, but there was more than that happening.
He would never know what it was as his consciousness faded and his and everyone at Barney's bodies were vaporized into the very same asteroid dust that comprised A61607219-Delta, which itself then combusted like an ancient star, turning supernova and obliterating the solar system that encircled it in one final deep breath of fiery consecration. Epilogue. The frigate wafted to and fro, destinationless among the gaps between the stars. 2 of its 3 passengers hadn't yet regained consciousness, and so the pilot watched over them as he reflected on the dissemination they had just escaped. No living being in the universe existed to have ever witnessed that weapon having been activated.
It should be recorded,
he thought as he wondered who had activated it and why or how. But did it matter? It went off, and the only 2 passengers in his care would know that he was the only one in the battle who had been too cowardly to have stayed and faced its wrath. That is, if he would ever tell them. The Frigaine was the first to awaken. He sat up to find Neptune piloting the frigate. Where did you learn how to fly these? He grumbled.
A driver's manual,
replied Neptune as he held the book up.
Can't believe you idiots even printed a version of it in Sin.
The Frigaine rubbed his eyes. What happened? He asked. Did we win? Neptune looked back at him.
We didn't lose,
he said. But in a way, they had. Where are we? Asked the Frigaine.
Somewhere. I don't know,
said Neptune.
We'll lick our wounds for a bit, then find our bearings.
He paused and sighed.
And then I need to live up to my part of the bargain.
Your part? Asked the Frigaine.
You fought with valor, did you not?
Asked Neptune. Well, I certainly hope Neptune didn't give him a chance to finish.
Now I have to lead with honor,
he said. The second passenger woke shortly after. Where am I? She asked. What happened? Neptune sighed again.
The rock is gone,
he told her, and the eyes of the naive Frigaine widened as he realized the implications of what had just transpired. Geila winced as she did the same. Barney? She whispered.
Gone,
said Neptune as she sobbed into all 4 of her hands. Everything she had built had once again been taken from her, including the one person who had given her the acceptance that no one else in the galaxy ever had. Where to from here? She finally asked between breaths as her sobbing subsided.
To rebuild, I guess,
said Neptune. To rebuild what? Asked the Frigaine. Neptune turned his head again and looked to his new, unlikely allies.
Let's start with Barney's,